I'm James Cahill, long retired professor of Chinese art history at the University of California in Berkeley, living now in Vancouver and embarking on this ambitious series of recorded lectures under the title A Pure and Remote View, Visualizing Early Chinese Landscape Painting. As some of you know, I've been going around for some years now complaining that Chinese painting specialists of my generation had failed to produce the kind of detailed, comprehensive history of Chinese painting, early Chinese painting, that through the Song Dynasty, that is the late 13th century, that we need, that we should have produced. And now our younger colleagues have turned against that kind of narrative art history, and they're unlikely to do it. So it's in an analogy that was much quoted. I said, it's as though we had abandoned the practice of architecture before we had built our city. And so here we are. We went around for some time in the 1960s, 70s doing large-scale photographing projects and cataloging projects and putting ourselves into a situation where we could have written such a history, but nobody did it. I myself wrote books on later Chinese painting instead, and various others that some of you know about. And others did good beginnings and semi-complete history, but at any rate, nobody produced the kind of big general history that I think we needed. Well, how great is the need, really? In a 1999 lecture that was later published, I quoted the art historian Ernst Gombrich, Sir Ernst Gombrich, about whom I'll have more to say later, writing this. He writes this: "But only twice on this globe, in ancient Greece and in Renaissance Europe, have artists striven systematically through a succession of generations, step by step, to approximate their images to the visible world and achieve likenesses that might deceive the eye." That's in his book called The Image in the Eye. Okay. Well, I quoted that, and then I went on to say, to add, as is often true of such global statements, this one needs the insertion of a single phrase, except for China. Later, I was able to meet Gombrich and talk with him and persuaded him, in fact, that China was the other great example of this phenomenon he's talking about, leaving aside ancient Greece, from which there isn't really enough to do much of history. There are really two traditions of painting in the whole of world art that to which Gombrich's pattern properly applies. One of them China, one of them European painting. That is a tradition in which large numbers of individual artists worked over the centuries, one after another, as if collectively, to make their images approximate better what they see in nature. I know that's a very old-fashioned formulation, and it's practically outmoded and almost prohibited these days. But I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm old enough to do what I want and not worry too much about the criticism. Okay. Histories of European painting would fill a library. On the other hand, for the Chinese tradition, which is as great and has as many artists and so on, we don't have one, not one. And that is exactly the problem, the situation that makes me feel so much real guilt for not having written the history. Okay, and here I am in my late years, one of the few people on Earth, and maybe the only one in some ways, with all the special access to materials and the training, which I'll talk about through study with great teachers and so on, feeling the sense of guilt that I didn't write the book. Okay, well, instead I'm embarking on this series of recorded lectures, which as I do them is turning out to have many great advantages over the book, much better visuals. Now that's what I want to talk a bit about, that is the idea of the visuals. I taught a course for many times in Berkeley and sometimes elsewhere on early Chinese paintings that approximates what I'm trying to cover in this series, Chinese painting through the Song Dynasty, with an emphasis on landscape. And these lectures will be somewhat based on that course. At the same time, I have to say that they will be very heavily emphasizing and almost limited to the visuals, that is, to the pictures, the paintings. And I'm going to be presenting these paintings, discussing them, showing images, showing details from them, and leaving out almost entirely the background in Chinese history and philosophy and Buddhism and all of that, which I'll suggest readings, and you can do that. You can get them that way. On my website and elsewhere, there will be readings you can do. But for the most part, I have to leave that out. So I have to emphasize that this series is not going to be the equivalent of a proper academic course, and I don't want it to be thought of that way. A proper academic course needs lots of things that I'm not going to be able to provide. I mean, interaction with the students and background lectures and all kinds of things. Anyway, it can be a supplement to a course. And if some academic professor wants to use it to have the students watch it and then the next day have correcting Cahill sessions with all the mistakes I make, which I'm sure are going to be a lot, that's okay. But it cannot be a course in itself. Anyway, I want to make that point very strongly. I feel I will plead guilty immediately to being terribly out of date in lots of things. I haven't kept up with what's happening in my field. And I'm sure that I'm going to make lots of mistakes, and people will feel misdating things or not using new methods, not using criteria that have been developed since my time. Well, there's no help for that. I can only plead old age and decades of having turned my attention rather to the later periods of Chinese art instead of this. So anyway, and I want to make one very strong recommendation, which I would make into a requirement if I could, and that is, don't try to take notes as I'm talking. That's a waste of time. All the information, the names, dates will be in handouts or my website or somewhere else, and you're going to be missing the point and failing to look at the paintings, which is what I really want people to be doing. And the whole point of this is to keep you, so to speak, riveted to the screen, watching the paintings I'm showing. Okay, this combination of me talking and you watching the picture is exactly what this is all about. Well, first of all, I want to spend a bit of time talking about my own background, my teachers, my predecessors, how I got where I am, why I feel competent at all to deliver these lectures. In fact, I feel, as I say, an obligation to do it while I still can. And I ask you to be patient with this, as with lots of other me on screen talking sessions in these lectures. I'll try to keep them to a minimum because they're not what they're mainly supposed to be about. But I want to lay out some general principles and talk about the background of the field. I think that's important too. I have a background there. I knew a lot of the people who are the big people I'll be talking about. I knew them well, and I took part in these things, and I think part of my heritage that I can pass on is going to be that. I'll begin by speaking with three people I studied with who represent at the very highest level what I take to be three great traditions of the studying of Chinese painting, and together they shape my way of seeing and working, and without any one of them these lectures would be very different. Okay. I ask you to be patient with this. We'll get to the paintings and works of art before very long. You can fast forward if you want to. I am not there to watch and see that you don't. I'm going to be talking first about several of my teachers, my most important teachers. And this is as part of the background for the whole series, background for me, background for Chinese painting studies as a whole. There were three of them. One seen here, Max Lohr. Max Lohr represented at the highest level the great German tradition of art history. And European or Western art history, as you know, probably starts more in Germany than anywhere else. I could name the great pioneers, but you know them, or some of you do. Anyway, Max began in Munich, studying with some of the great people there. He spent 9 years in China as the director of a German Sinological Institute in China during the war, actually, during the Second World War, and he was interned there too, and published quite a bit at that time. He had learned the Chinese language and was able to do research in Chinese sources, and that was very important. Max was one of the two people, I think. The other was Alexander Soper, whom I'll speak about in a bit. One of the two people who combined first in his generation these two great disciplines, art history on the one hand and sinology, or Chinese studies, on the other. Up to that time, there was pretty much a kind of battle between them, with angry charges and bad reviews and so forth, each of them saying that the other couldn't really do the job properly because they weren't equipped. The sinologues, because they would say the Chinese, the art historians couldn't do it because they couldn't read the language, and the art historians would say the sinologues or sinologists couldn't do it because they didn't know how to use their eyes. Max Lohr made that charge against, for instance, Bernard Karlgren, whom he had a great feud with. At any rate, Lohr combined the two of them, and very effectively, and wrote articles while he was in China on Chinese bronzes, early Chinese art, Chinese archaeology, all that, using Chinese materials, Chinese sources. In 1950-51, probably, 50-51, he was repatriated and went back to Munich, where he had a job at the Ethnological Museum there, but almost immediately left there to move to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to begin his teaching there. And there I was in the first row on his first lecture as one of his disciples right away. Anyway, so I studied for years and years with Max Lohr. Well, he later moved to, after teaching quite a few years at Michigan, he moved to Harvard and taught there until he retired. Here we see him outside the Fogg Museum at Harvard. That's, of course, he's looking very typically well dressed, neat, well-fitting suit, pressed. Between us is Lena Kim, a Korean art historian who took her PhD at Harvard and is still active in Korea. That's her son down below. All right, so much for now for Max Lohr. We will come back to him, of course. He ended up writing a book on Chinese painting that I'll talk about. The next of them, representing the great Japanese tradition of Chinese painting studies, was Shujiro Shimada, seen here at a dinner with myself late in his life. Shimada was, not only for Japan, but more especially for Kyoto, part of a great tradition of sinological studies, or Chinese studies. He spoke Chinese badly, but enthusiastically, shall we say. He read Chinese marvelously, and he didn't publish a lot, but what he did publish was extremely important. The studies of texts as well as studies of paintings and of traditions of paintings, or kinds of painting, and so on. Shimada, when I first met him, I was in Kyoto as a Fulbright student in 1954 to 55. He was then working at the Kyoto National Museum as a curator, but also teaching a course at Kyoto University, which of course I sat in on. Later, Shimada was forced to move, came to the U.S. He ended up teaching at Princeton. This was through some misfortune in Japan, well, anyway, that's another story. And he became a much admired and much loved teacher at Princeton, and had a number of important students. Shimada, as you see him here, he was lean and intense. I always thought of him as like the great swordsman in Kurosawa's film Seven Samurai, the one who, by terrible irony, is killed with a bullet from a gun. Nobody could best him in swordsmanship, but he's killed by a bullet. Anyway, Shimada had that kind of inner intensity. He always seemed not quite well, but he still kept going and accomplished quite a lot. Anyway, that you can get something of character from looking at the person, which is partly why I put on these photographs. They're also revealing in other ways. Here is Shimada with his wine glasses still full, and here's me with a whole row of empty glasses in front of me. Yeah, very revealing. The third person I worked with, who was very important to me and to the field and generally, was C.C. Wong, Wang Jichen. C.C. Wong, born and raised in a fairly small town near Suzhou, near the city of Suzhou, near the Great Lake, the Taihu in southeast China or southern China. Anyway, he moved to Shanghai and spent some years there and was one of the leading disciples of a major figure in Chinese collecting and connoisseurship and study of Chinese painting generally, that is Wu Hufan. Wu Hufan has recently been the subject of a very good book by Clarissa von Spee. Anyway, important character. And Cece and another very important connoisseur named Xu Bangda were his two leading disciples, you might say. Xu Bangda is still living in Beijing, not really functioning anymore, but still alive. And he remained in the Chinese mainland, whereas C.C. Wang moved in 1947 to New York and lived there for the rest of his life. He traveled a lot. He traveled to the east, to Japan, and eventually back to China and so on. Anyway, he lived in New York in a large, lovely apartment with his daughter and wife and eventually son. He was not only a collector, but also a major painter and a dealer. That is, he sold paintings from time to time, important groups of paintings, for instance, the Metropolitan Museum. Fong bought or arranged sales to the Metropolitan Museum from C.C. Wang. So a lot of the best paintings in American collections came through him. What else to say about him? Well, okay, anyway, this is C.C. in his late years. He was never actually a teacher in the sense of an academic teacher, but I and others learned a lot from him anyway. He didn't publish very much, but he talked, and actually one learned by looking at paintings with him. That's really true of the others too. I'm certainly not claiming to have combined the best of these three great traditions of scholarship. That would be presumptuous and untrue. But I did absorb enough from them to have some sense of how these people looked at paintings, thought about paintings, talked about paintings, by looking at paintings with them and by studying at least of the other two who were more academic scholars. How paintings were understood and appreciated in each of these three great traditions. I got the feeling eventually that I could look at a painting and have some sense usually of how each of the others might respond to it, and they would respond very differently. There are, of course, questions of right and wrong. In a sense, C.C. Wang was a better connoisseur than either of the other two, much more widely experienced in his connoisseurship. Although generally I will say that the Japanese, Shimada, are very strong on the kinds of paintings that were preserved in Japan, what we call sogenga, Songyuan painting as preserved in Japan. That's the Japanese term. That was Shimada's great specialty, and the great weakness of the Chinese who didn't preserve it and don't really appreciate it all that much, and so on. C.C. and other Chinese connoisseurs are at their strongest in Chinese painting post-Song, really, although actually early painting too sometimes. And Max Starr, I'll talk about his strengths and weaknesses in Chinese painting. Here is C.C. Wang at an exhibition, wearing his Chinese scholar's jacket at a formal event. And next please, here he is with my wife Xingyuan at the same event, which is some kind of exhibition opening. And I'm leaving out two other art historians of some importance. Alexander Soper, never a teacher of mine really, though I spent time with him, knew him very well. He taught at Bryn Mawr College and also at the Institute for Fine Arts in New York for many years. Edited a magazine or a journal called Artibus Asiae, published a lot, did translation, had a very strong art history training at Princeton, actually. And I'll speak about that especially when we come to our third lecture on Six Dynasties painting. I'll talk about Soper more. And the other important figure is Oswald Sirén, another certainly prominent figure in Chinese painting studies, with whom I spent some time, a lot of time actually. Here is Oswald Sirén in his garden in China, in an old picture. Here he is at a private viewing in Japan with Shimada and others. This shows how we often used to view scroll paintings in Japan, rolling them out on the floor and kneeling on the floor to look at them. Rather awkward, but it worked. Sirén, born in Finland but lived in Stockholm in Sweden most of his life, so we think of him as a Swedish scholar. You could say, no, he did not combine did not combine art history training with sinology. He never learned Chinese. And that was a great weakness with Sirén. He used other people. He hired people to do translating for him, to do research for him. I was his research assistant for 3 months in Stockholm in the winter of 1956, working with him on what was his 7-volume last major publication, Chinese Painting Leading Masters and Principles, reading 7-volume art history anyway. So Sirén had in some sense been a disciple of Bernard Berenson, and he started out writing about Italian painting, moved into Chinese. And Berenson, I think it was, who persuaded him to go into Chinese painting studies with the thought of becoming the Bernard Berenson of Chinese painting. That is, straightening it all out and figuring out who the great masters were and finding where their works were, listing them, and deciding which of them were genuine, all of that. That's what Sirén should have done, and in fact didn't do. Sirén, well, at the end of his career, after he published his 7-volume book, Alexander Soper wrote a review in Artibus Osiae in which he came out and said openly, Sirén's still alive, that Sirén had never really developed an eye for Chinese painting, which, alas, is all too true. There are lots of limitations in Sirén's book you find if you try reading them. Okay, on to the next slide and the next set of issues. Okay, here is a lovely old photograph of a bunch of people in Taichung, rather outside Taichung. It was a time when the great Palace Museum collection, the former Manchu Imperial collection, which had been packed up and moved around during wartime, great story, had been moved to Taiwan, or the bulk of it. Some things were left behind in China. I'll talk about that another time. Anyway, moved to Taiwan. It was being stored outside the city of Taichung in central Taiwan. Not yet a museum. That was later that they built the Palace Museum in Taipei and moved the collection there. But here it was in Taichung, and one had to, well, live in Taichung, and sometimes I say, as you see here, go around in tropical garb. Actually, I rode a bicycle back and forth between Taichung and this place outside where the paintings were stored, where the collection was stored. There were caves or tunnels dug into the hillside, and the things were kept there some of the time, sometimes, but most of the time, in storage rooms, storage buildings outside. Okay, myself at one end, identifiable, I think, large ears and glasses and holding the hat. At the other end, C.C. Wong again. Okay, I had been given the extraordinary privilege of going through a lot of the collection, which was mostly still stored in crates, practically all still stored in crates, from the time it had been moved from mainland China. And I was allowed not only to go through it, but to publish some paintings from it, many of them, some of them for the first time, or certainly the first time in color, in my Skira book, the book I wrote for the series by Albert Skira. I'll talk about that later, simply called Chinese Painting. Popular, famous book. Made my reputation, I guess. Anyway, Cece and I traveled to Taichung together and spent several months, I guess it was. The third person who was with us, I mean, looking at paintings with us, seen just next to C.C. Wong here on the left, not the person looking over their shoulder, the shorter man who was a Mr. Zhang working in storage, but the next person smiling, holding his hands together, that's Li Lin San. Good friend, great guy. He later became the vice director of the Palace Museum. And the three of us, C.C. Wong, Li Lin San, and myself, as I say, spent days looking through the collection, and me, with their advice in some part, making selections for reproduction in the Skura book. But it was much more than that. These things hadn't been gone through seriously by any, major connoisseur like C.C. Wong or a Westerner like myself for, a long, long time. And Li Lin San referred to us as the three painting worms. It's a term he invented by analogy with bookworm, because we were so immersed, so wound up, literally, in the painting. And these were great days. I can still remember them, the excitement of seeing, great paintings appearing before us, things that were little known. In the center, standing next to me with glasses, is Henry Bevel. Henry Bevel, I'll speak of him again later. He is a photographer for the National Gallery at that time. And he was Albert Skura's favorite photographer. In fact, he used him for most of his books. Henry Bevel would travel wherever he had to go to make photographs for Albert Skura's books, photographing everything in great 8x10 transparencies or whatever. Anyway, okay, that's Henry Bevel. In the center is Zhuang Yan, or Zhuang Shangyan. He, another great person. He was then this thin person with glasses looking out at us. He was the director of the Palace Museum at that time. Fine man, good connoisseur, very helpful, and fine calligrapher. He wrote calligraphy in the manner of the Emperor Huizong, slender gold calligraphy. At his right, as we look at the picture, and I'm always going to use right and left as the picture, not the right and left of the people in it. To his right is Tan Zhong, who's the director of the Central Museum at that time. And on his left, a Mr. Wu, who was a ceramic specialist. I never knew him so well, but he was important for ceramics. And piled in front of us is all of Henry Bevel's equipment. And here we are anyway, getting ready to do our great photographing and having done a lot of our great viewing of Chinese painting. This is extremely important, not only for me, but for Chinese painting studies generally, because the collection, this great collection, was being opened up. Here's a view of the storage area of the Palace Museum collection at that time, inside one of the storage buildings located outside Taichung, with the paintings and other objects still in the crates in which they had been packed and shipped all the way from Beijing many years before. Another curator is seated in the foreground. I can't recall his name. Then, later, in 1961, there was an exhibition of from the Palace Museum called Chinese Art Treasures. Many of you are familiar with that. You see these four people, I'll speak of in a minute, are all holding the catalog, which probably many of you know about. And the exhibition opened at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. I was at the Freer Gallery then as a curator of Chinese art, but the Freer Gallery never had any outside exhibitions that exhibited only its own things. And so the exhibition was the National Gallery. Then it went on to other cities and was seen by huge numbers of people. And it was the second great foreign exhibition of Chinese art, I guess you would say, after the 1935-36 exhibition in London, which was badly marred by a very bad selection of paintings from China. Wrong, not genuine paintings instead of the great ones. This, by the contrast, included many of the greatest early paintings of China, which were in the Palace Museum collection. And the selections that C.C. Wong and Li Lin San and I had made going through them was important to that. Ashwin Lippi, I'll speak of him in a moment, standing next to me, the man with the mustache. Ashwin Lippi and I were the people in charge of choosing the paintings and writing about them and so on for the catalog. Ashwin was responsible for painting, but he depended a lot on me and my writings. We hadn't spent as much time with the collection. He was a fine scholar. But at any rate, okay, let me talk about the people. Over here, with the glasses again, is Henry Bevel, smiling. He's the National Gallery photographer, as I said. And over on the right, bald, tall, looking like Daddy Warbucks, sort of, very impressive man, fine man, is John Pope, director of the Freer Gallery then, and specialist in Chinese ceramics. Okay, back to Ashwin Lippy. Ashwin Lippy was a prince. Actually, his real proper name was Ernst Ashwin, Prince zur Lippy Biesterfeld. Lippy Biesterfeld was a defunct principality or kingdom located between Holland and Germany. And he was the prince of that. His brother was Prince Bernhard, the consort of the Queen of Holland. Anyway, Ashwin Lippy, however, in spite of his, and he actually published his first publication, which was a translation of a dissertation on, of a treatise on bamboo painting, which he published in Germany, and he used the name Ernst Ashwin Prinz zur Lippy Biesterfeld. But by the time he came to New York and was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, he was simply Ashwin Lippy. I knew him very well because I spent a year at the Met as a Fulbright student, 1953 to 54, in the Asiatic department's offices, and was right next to him, and we spent a lot of time together. Okay, anyway, here we are having pulled together this really great exhibition, which opened, as I say, in 1961. Now, we made, by the way, a set of slides at this exhibition. Henry Bevel did, that is, with the help of the Freer photographer. Sets of slides, all original slides, large sets, and made them available at cost, as the Freer Gallery always did, to educational institutions and museums and so on all over the country, and actually abroad too. And that made these great paintings available, accessible for the first time in great and marvelous slides. We had to study up to that time using slides made from old black and white reproductions. You couldn't really see the details. So it was important in that way. Now going on. I had the good fortune also to be a member of the first delegation of art people to go to China from the U.S. after the opening up of China, and I mean the Nixon-Kissinger opening in the early 1960s. This was in 1970s. This was the delegation, the first delegation was in 1973, and it was called an archaeology delegation. But the reason for that is because art history was not a recognized discipline in China at that time. They had no respect for art historians, but archaeology was. Archaeology revealed the past, and they were much engaged in it themselves and using it as propaganda for the rest of the world and so on. Okay, so we were an archaeology delegation, and we were led, as I say, by Sherman Lee, a powerful, remarkable, very fine man, seen here in the very center, looking out at us, the man with a sort of reddish face and bow tie, holding his hat. He was director for many years of the Cleveland Art Museum. He wrote the book many people use as a text on Asian art. He had a remarkable range of knowledge, including Indian and Japanese art, and quite a lot of Western art too, for that matter. Quite remarkable in many ways. Dynamic energy, great organizer, everything. Here is Sherman Lee playing ping pong with our Chinese delegation leader on one of our stops. He lost, but only because, as we decided, any American can be beaten to ping pong by any Chinese. Sherman had been a champion, actually, as he'd been in other sports. Next to him, also wearing glasses, older man looking out at us, is Lawrence Sickman, a major pioneer scholar in Chinese art studies. Here is Lawrence Sickman as a young art scholar, seen outside a dealer's shop in Luoyang. And next, please. Here he is in his later years. He ended up as the director of the Nelson Gallery, later Nelson Atkins Art Museum in Kansas City, and put together there a great collection of Chinese paintings, some of which we'll see. So I'll talk more about Sickman. He was along on the delegation in, as I say, 1973. We are seen here near at one of the great 6th century stone lions outside the city of Nanking. Anyway, posing for our photograph. Behind Sherman Lee and Sickman is sort of red-faced, dark-haired, is Arthur Wright. He was not an art historian, but a Chinese historian, historian of China, that is, teaching at Yale in his late years. Behind him, myself, wearing a necktie, glasses, blue shirt, and so on. Okay, then other people, let's see. Over here to the two to the right, sort of with his head turned, looking bald, not bald, but tall forehead, is Tom Lawton, who became the director of the Freer Gallery later. Let's see then. And over to the left, wearing dark glasses and a cap and older man, is Richard Rudolph, who was the one real archaeologist among us. He had done digs in China in the old days. He was older. I can talk about others as we go, but those are the major people. Now, we spent a month in China going around making a tour of Chinese museums and collections, other important sites, on which we saw and photographed a large number of early and important paintings, among other things. And so it was another opening up project, and led to the availability of a lot of slides of paintings that had not been available before. Here is the delegation visiting the Palace Museum in Beijing. Sherman Lee at the left wearing a hat, Arthur Wright, Virginia Kane turned away from us. And next, please. And here are Sickman, Sherman Lee, Tom Lawton, and others entering for the first time the Huihuaguan, or the Hall of Paintings at the Palace Museum, where we would see major masterworks of painting. This is a very exciting moment. Okay, the next one now. That looks very different indeed. Much less organized, rather disheveled looking, in fact, obviously with a much less capable leader and organizer, namely myself, over here on the front right, wearing the brown jacket, again a little bit too small, smiling. Anyway, that's myself. This is the Chinese painting, old Chinese painting delegation, a follow-up delegation that went to China in 1977. And by that time, one could call oneself an art historian or a painting specialist, and we went as that. I was the chair, as I say. Next to me, looking at, well, everybody's looking out really, holding her camera, is Anne Clapp, who taught for many years at Wellesley College and now retired, published quite a lot anyway. And next to her, wearing the yellow cap, is Ellen Johnston Lang, very important art historian, important specialist in Chinese painting, prolific, published on a lot of subjects, important work. She was my vice chair for this delegation. I was confronted suddenly, unexpectedly, at a meeting in D.C., Washington, D.C., in the committee that was sending us, with choosing a vice chair. I hadn't realized I needed one. And looking around the table and seeing all the people in front of me, I saw three big guns, male big guns in the Chinese painting field, I should speak about, who were here, and realized if I chose any one of them, it would be somewhat disconcerting to the other two, perhaps. So, and I said, Ellen, be my vice chair. One of the few smart moves I made in that. Anyway, okay, the three I was looking at were tallest of all in the center back, light jacket, glasses, tall man, is Wen Fong. I don't need to tell anybody who Wen Fong is, one of the really important art historians, Chinese art historians in our field for, shall we say, my generation, slightly younger than myself, still very much alive and active. Next to him, smiling, wearing a necktie, next to him to the left, is Nelson Wu, close friend, good guy, underestimated early figure in the study of Chinese painting in the West. He gave lectures in New York while I was a student in D.C. that I attended and was very much impressed by. And he was teaching at Yale then. Later he went on to Washington University in St. Louis and retired there. He didn't publish a lot, but what he did was quite important. He was someone I liked very much, admired very much. He did publish other things, a novel and so on. He was a literary person, among other things. And then the third big gun, to the left of him, wearing a light blue jacket, tall forehead again, looking out, smiled, open shirt, is Weigom Ho, Weigom, who worked for many years with under Sherman Lee, well, not exactly under, with Sherman Lee at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and then went on to work for some years at the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City. Weigom was probably the best of us in, well, textual studies, Chinese art studies of the kind you did from books. He was great at that, and absolutely, I mean, the best trained and the best scholar of that kind among us. He was more than that, but he was that particularly. Published quite a lot, and anyway, it's very important. Died tragically not too many years ago. Other people in the picture I should point out. Okay, upper right now. Upper right, his hair sort of slung off to one side, open shirt, dark jacket, is Mark Wilson, who was a protege of Sickman and became the director of the Nelson Gallery, and has held that post for many years and is just now retiring. He married a former student of mine. Anyway, that's another story. Mark Wilson. Next to him, to the left of him, dark hair, smiling, looking out, rather modestly hidden behind everybody, is Susan Bush, someone I like and admire enormously, very important to the field, co-author and major author of the book we'll use on early Chinese texts on painting. I'll talk about that book as we go on. Susan, as I say, sort of typically modest here. Anyway, who else? Down in front center, not modest at all, not definitely front and center by choice, is Fu Shan, younger scholar from Taiwan. Anyway, well, enough of that. Let's go on to see what happened in the rest of the pictures here. Now, this shows me on one of the it's on the Chinese painting delegation, of course, with the then director of the Palace Museum, the white-haired gentleman on the left, looking at a scroll painting. This is not one of our proper viewings, which would be very different to be held in storage rooms and very different. Anyway, this is a formal viewing of some kind. And he's showing it's actually a painting attributed to an artist named Zhang Zhixian. Here's another view with Ellen Lang in the foreground. I must correct what I just said. We were not being shown the great early scroll in the original, of course, but we're being presented formally with a facsimile of it by the Palace Museum's director. We were allowed to make slides from everything we saw, and that was extremely important. The second time they started by saying we couldn't, but I argued as the chair that we absolutely needed to, because this delegation was not just for us to see things, it was for our colleagues back in the U.S. and all around the world, and that we needed slides for our teaching and study. And anyway, we're allowed to take slides, and we shot thousands of them. Details and sections of hand scrolls and leaves of albums, bang, bang. All of us, or most of the delegation, were fanatic slide makers, as I myself was. This is a photo of Ray Schwartz, the second from the left, the Freer Gallery photographer, who carried out the great photographic project in Taichung in 1963, 62-3, the winter. Myself at far right, and two others out of the many who came to watch, Father Harry van der Stoppen at the far left, and Zhu Li, second from the right. These two month-long delegations, 1973 and 1977, along with the photographing of the Palace Museum collection in Taiwan, and also the various photographing projects and photographing of collections in Japan and the US and Europe that had been accessible to us earlier gave us a new degree of visual coverage of Chinese paintings all over the world. And we were in principle ready to settle back and write our histories. Somebody should have written, as I started out my talk saying, somebody should have written a detailed, comprehensive history of Chinese painting through the end of the Song dynasty, from the earliest period up to the end of Song, the late 13th century. The kind of history of these lectures will attempt to outline, at least, to make up for the missing book, so to speak. But nobody did. Max Lohr tried in his general book, about which I'll speak later, but went badly wrong on problems of dating and attribution of paintings. I'll speak about that. In many ways, it's a good book, but in that way, it's not a good book. Oswald Suren's books simply don't serve the purpose, as you know if you've tried reading them. As I say, he didn't really have an eye for painting, and his writing is not very interesting or very perceptive. He didn't arrive at the deep understanding that should underlie such a history. Michael Sullivan, somebody I haven't mentioned up to now, but important in our field. Michael Sullivan got off to a good start with two important books on early Chinese landscape, but then he didn't follow it up, didn't continue into the great period in the 10th to 13th centuries. I myself could have made a good try at such a book, but instead I devoted my publishing efforts mainly to the later periods, after the Song. And that's why, as I see it, we're in the predicament we're now in. And it's a big reason why I'm doing these lectures, to go some small way toward ameliorating, remedying this gap in our collective knowledge, and maybe to encourage some younger scholar eventually to buck the trend and write the book that we need. It still can be done. I mean, the materials are all there. The information is much better than I had. In fact, there's been a lot more individual studies, but nobody has done the big book. There are a number of very good books on Chinese art history and Chinese painting history available, although none that quite corresponds to the book that I think we need, this general history of painting through the Song. And I'll be making references to several of these in my lectures and my handouts, and because I think they're books that many of you will have available or be able to find in the library or whatever. There are mainly three books that I'll be talking about and referring to. Okay, here we go. First is Max Lohr, The Great Painters of China, published in Phaidon Press in 1980. Lohr, as I've said, was my teacher, and great man in his way. And it's a fine book in some ways. At the same time, Lohr, unfortunately, accepts a lot of paintings as early and as by the artists whom they're attributed to, that others of us, certainly myself, do not accept anymore. So his book is badly marred, I'm afraid, by all these unfortunate choices of what should be early paintings and aren't. Okay, I'll talk about that later, and then meanwhile just refer to it as Lohr or Lohr's book. Secondly, there's a very good book that's intended as a general text to be used in classes in Chinese art, replacing older books. And this is by two people, Robert Thorpe and Richard Vinograd. Thorpe is especially strong in archaeology, Vinograd in later Chinese painting history, theory, and so on, both very good scholars. And I will be referring to this for its plates and sometimes for the text. It is, as I say, intended as a textbook and relatively inexpensive, paperback, and certainly you can use that. A good account by two excellent scholar writers. Third, and more complicated, here's a collaborative work, 6 people actually involved in writing it, titled 3,000 Years of Chinese Painting, Yale University Press, 1997. It's sometimes listed with my colleague Richard Barnhart as the author, but that's a matter of alphabetizing. Actually, it was I myself who was involved in the original meeting. We planned the book, and I laid out what I thought was a good plan for it and suggested collaborators, and we went ahead with that. We'll use it for the early periods through the Song dynasty. The part through the Tang Dynasty is by Wong, who teaches at the University of Chicago. Excellent scholar, of course, famous scholar. The second part through the Sung Dynasty by Richard Barnhart, close colleagues, good friend, sometimes arguments between us, but anyway, he's now retired from teaching at Yale University for many years. Two excellent scholars. They were, as I say, my own recommendations for writing these sections, so that if, in talking about them, I differ on some points, or say, the 3,000 Years book says something, but I think something. This is in a spirit of good scholarly disagreement and scholarly respect. I'm not in any way putting them down, that is. Okay, I'll also speak later about an introduction to this book, which I think you should read by myself. Less important for us is my own old Skira book, Chinese Painting. Here it is, the original edition, published in 1960. Written actually while I was still doing my doctoral dissertation, very early work, written in the late 1950s. It's quite excellent color plates, especially for the time. So this is a kind of a breakthrough in the publication of early Chinese painting, and really good plates tipped on the pages, as if you know. It has also come out in a cheaper, well, I don't have it here, a paperback edition, which many of you can buy, because they're generally available. At any rate, it's an old book, but still useful for the pictures mainly. I will have references on some of my handouts to, and the website maybe, to the book by Oswald Siren, a scholar I'll be talking about as we go on, or have already talked about, excuse me, titled Chinese Painting Leading Masters and Principles, 7 volumes. I will use it only for the plates, actually. The volume 3 is the volume for the early plates. So if I use the term Siren, I mean volume 3, plate something or other. The plates are very good and reproduce a lot of things that are not otherwise easily accessible. And finally, a kind of semi-catalog book by my major colleague Wong, very famous. I don't need to speak much about him. Major scholar, taught at Princeton for many years, now retired, now in China. Titled Beyond Representation. This is, in some sense, a catalog of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, of their collection of early Chinese paintings, largely put together by him. It's more than a catalog, really, however. It goes some way toward being the history of Chinese painting from the 8th to the 14th centuries, the kind of history that I think we need. And although it has lots of valuable information and observation, translations of texts, and so on, and as strong as I am not in calligraphy, I never was and cannot pretend to be strong in calligraphy. Wong definitely is, Richard Barnhart, others. But the book, nonetheless, doesn't quite fulfill the function of the general history of early Chinese painting that I think we need. And I differ from Wong on some matters, as everybody knows. So I recommend it generally without using it as a background text. Also to be recommended here are books by Michael Sullivan. I don't have copies to show you. Michael Sullivan, now retired, living in Cambridge, Oxford in England, and taught for some years at Stanford and so on. Books, one titled The Birth of Landscape Painting in China, 1962, and a follow-up book called Chinese Landscape Painting, Volume 2, The Sui and Tang Dynasties, 1980. He also wrote a more general book titled Symbols of Eternity, The Art of Landscape Painting in China, 1979. These are important books, but they don't quite make up what I take to be the missing comprehensive history of Chinese painting. They stop at the Tang Dynasty, and otherwise they're rather different from what I'm going to do. Okay, some general reading. Anybody who wants to follow these lectures and gain some understanding of the development of painting, especially landscape painting through Sung, should have some background information on Chinese painting, the materials it uses, the forms that are used, and so on, things like that, more than I'm going to be able to convey in my lectures. So I recommend strongly that you do, toward the beginning, separately readings to fill these matters in. I can't do them in my lectures. I'll be putting recommended readings on my website to accompany the lectures as we go along, but to begin with, I want to recommend rather highly that you read the introductory lecture in There Are 3,000 Years book by myself at the beginning of the book. This is on pages 5 to 12, called Approaches to Chinese Painting. That talks a lot about forms and materials and all the matters in which, the ways in which it differs from European painting that we're used to. Also, where is it now? Oh, damn it. Oh, yes, underneath here. Sorry. On the matters of how Chinese painting differs from Western painting, and on other ways, there's this very good book by Jerome Silbergelt. Jerome Silbergelt, younger colleague, very respected, good friend, still teaching at Princeton University. But early on, he wrote this book called Chinese Painting Style, and 1982, University of Washington Press. Now, both pieces of writing, as I say, outline the forms in which Chinese paintings are made and the tools and the materials and the conventions it uses, something about how it differs from the European and American paintings that we're familiar with. On that matter, how Chinese painting differs in big ways from Western painting, I want to say a few words before we go on. And that is, I believe strongly that we need to steer clear of certain Chinese popular formulations that started out as poetic truths and have come to be taken as though they were somehow historical truths or absolute truths, and have been delivered endlessly over and over again as great truths about the subject. And I have, throughout my career, tended to downplay these a bit. Writing and painting have a single origin. No, they don't. They're very separate and different arts. That's one of them. Writing and painting have a single origin. No, they're separate, profoundly different arts. I'll talk about that as we go on. Chinese painting doesn't depict the outer forms, it depicts the inner essence of the things. Well, okay. When I was a teacher, I used to tell the students that if any one of them put any form of that in any one of their papers, they're going to get some very rude remarks in the margin. It's not that it's totally without truth, but it's one of those big cliches that stifle thinking, I think. The old myth about the spiritual East and the materialist West, forget it. None of those really, I think, all of them are simplistic. None of them really help very much, in my opinion. They're misleading. Now we go on about this series, and we begin to look. Here's a painting for the first time. Very important painting, too. Okay, here we see the whole painting and a detail from it. This is, it's actually attributed to a early Song artist named Xu Shi, but that's some fairly meaningless attribution. In fact, it's an anonymous painting in the Shanghai Museum, which I would date to the 10th or 11th century, and a detail of it. It represents, as you see, bamboo and old tree by a rock. And it's painted in ink on silk, and I've used it in various contexts, often, to represent what seems to be the apogee or high point of realism or lifelikeness or truth to nature, whatever we want to call it, in Chinese painting, along with some landscapes of the same period, which we'll see and I'll talk about at great length. It's dedicated to portraying the natural world with deep understanding as well as remarkable degree of visual faithfulness, as I say, whatever we want to call this. Again, this is an unfashionable idea. Good graduate students, back when I was still teaching at Berkeley, especially in the late period, tried very hard to convince me that it was meaningless to talk about different degrees of lifelikeness, since all representation is convention. They would argue, I can't reproduce their arguments because I never could believe it. Since all representation is convention anyway, one picture is as lifelike as any other. It still doesn't make sense to me, but even really high-class, very good people made the argument. I remember Joseph Kerner, who went on to teach at Harvard, also my future daughter-in-law, a wonderful young scholar. Anyway, making this argument. But I still can't reproduce it, and I can't quite believe it. Okay, now here is this great, I think, anonymous painting in the detail, it's very hard to hard to see how it was done. You can say it was done by some technique of resist, that is, as if you painted on the silk with wax or something else that resisted the ink, and then you painted an ink wash over it. Okay, maybe so, but that doesn't go very far to explaining just or accounting just how this picture was done. It is, as I say, kind of a high point of what do we call it? Visual truthfulness, something. And now next to it I put, what is this? This is a hand scroll. I'll talk later about a hand scroll. It's a horizontal scroll, painting in ink on paper, supposed to be by, maybe really by, the great 11th century statesman poet Zhou, or Su Dongpo, well known to all Chinese. And it's in the Shanghai Museum, and it represents, again, bamboo, tree, and rock. The bamboo's rather low here, it's growing out of the ground. The old tree twisting around, and the rock down below. This is a subject that Su Dongpo seems to have painted often. He also painted bamboo by itself. He had a very limited range of subjects. But anyway, the point wasn't to represent the thing. The one picture, the one attributed to Zhou, has an almost photographic realism, I would call it. The other one, by maybe by Su Dongpo, not realistic at all, anything but, rather anti-realistic. But his paintings were not supposed to be representationally truthful. That was the last thing he wanted. He was an early figure, practically the beginning figure, in what came to be a great tradition school, whatever you want to call it, of scholar amateur painting, painting by educated, cultivated men who were not trained as professionals, professional artists, that is. Okay, we'll talk about that later in the course. I'll talk about it at great length. But it eventually becomes the mainstream of Chinese painting, or what is perceived as the mainstream, from the Yuan dynasty on, after the end of this lecture series, actually. Okay, without talking about that at length, which comes later, I simply want to say that this is two profoundly different kinds of painting. And once this type that represented by Su Dongpo's painting was accepted as potentially great painting, everything changes. Now, any Chinese connoisseur, any traditional Chinese connoisseur, confronted with these two paintings and saying, which one do you want, would immediately choose the Su Dongpo, the Su Shi. It's a very old painting. It's been much damaged and retouched, but still, it may be a Su Dongpo painting under it. His painting was intended not to be descriptive, but to be expressive. His friend Mi Fu, famous calligrapher, painter, theorist and all that, Mi Fu said of Su Dongpo's paintings that the rocks and trees in them were all coiled up like the sorrows in his breast. That's something like that. I quote it from memory. So it's expressive, as I say. This one has lots of seals. I'll talk about seals when we talk about other paintings, red marks all at the beginning and end, and lots of inscriptions attached to it. Whereas the other one is completely bare. It has a tiny little inscription I'll talk about later when we come to it, but completely bare of any appreciation, any signs of appreciation. It's come down through the centuries, unnoticed practically, suddenly published for the first time in the 1950s, I remember. At any rate, these two raise very powerfully, I think, the issue of, well, lifelikeness, realism, naturalism, fidelity to nature, whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to worry about terms. At a symposium a few years ago in Princeton, farewell symposium for one fall on his retirement, Dick Barnhart, my colleague, gave a paper on, he called it mimesis in Sung painting, mimetic, or another word for resemblance, whatever, made one thing look like another thing, imitation. And it was jumped on by the usual people, for the usual reasons, because we aren't supposed to be using that concept. I mean, it isn't popular. The famous art historian Ernst Gombrich, known to many of you, lived in England much of his life, in his book Art and Illusion, 1960, and in his other writings, sets forth a pattern of development within an artistic tradition in which each significant artist tries to adjust the schemata or the representational conventions that he inherits from the past to bring them up closer to natural appearances as he observes them by looking out at nature. And through this process, he and others gradually move toward greater realism. As a kind of progress, I hasten to say that I don't mean, and Gombrich certainly didn't mean, we don't attach positive value to judgments of more or less realistic, more or less true to nature. More realistic art isn't necessarily better art for him or for me. I yield to nobody in my admiration for Japanese painting, including some of the furthest from realism, like Rimpa or some schools of Nangas, some types of Nanga. I respect Indian and Persian and Islamic painting a lot without really understanding it as much as I do East Asian painting. I'm excited by Cubism and Picasso and all the rest of Matisse and so forth. Okay, so it isn't just a matter of he isn't saying, I'm not saying more realistic is better. But anyway, this pattern of movement toward more and more true to life painting is set up by Gombrich in this matter of this pattern of what he calls schema and correction, that is the inherited schemata or conventions and the corrections the artists make to make them more realistic. Okay, this is very unpopular. Gombrich is very unpopular. Gombrich ended up, practically ostracized from the art history profession by the more progressive people, just because the kind of art history he was doing and theorizing about wasn't popular anymore. I used to joke with my students that that Gombrich bashing had become part of the undergraduate major. That is, you had to in the undergraduate curriculum, you had to learn how to criticize Gombrich to be a respected art historian. I said that with some irony, some bitterness. I don't believe he deserved it. I believe there's still a lot to be said for that kind of approach. And what I'm leading up to saying is that it's the kind of approach that I myself am going to be using in this series, like it or not. I mean, I know whether I get jumped on for it or not, and I probably will be, all right. Okay, here is a pair of landscape paintings. One of them colorful, the one on the left, colorful, linear, in a Tang style, that is 8th century style probably, a copy, but early copy after a work of that period. I'll show this at length and talk about it later, very famous painting. And the one on the right from the 11th century, this one by a known artist, an individual artist, who in fact signs it, adds the date, and even a title. So we know it's by Guo, and that it's painted in 1072. And it was it's titled Early Spring. I'll talk a lot about this painting. It's one of our grand masterpieces. Okay, Gombrich was coming to realize late in his life that the only other artistic tradition of painting in world art, other than the European tradition that is, the only other one that follows this pattern, stretching over centuries and engaging a large number of artists and movements and produces a great amount of great painting, to arrive finally at a very high degree of realism. The only other one is Chinese painting. Gombrich realized this. I realized it. It's part of the reason I'm attempting this series, really, because as I've said, where European painting has histories and histories and histories, and it's all laid out, and we know exactly how you get from Giotto to Michelangelo, say. Chinese painting doesn't have this. It isn't all laid out. There isn't agreement, and so on. Okay, anyway. So even though this pattern is unfashionable and for some people even objectionable, I'm going to be following it in my in my lectures, both because I believe it still has a great value and embodies a certain degree of truth, and also because it isn't being done very much today, and I think it needs to be. So, for better or worse, I'm going to be taking a very Gombrichian view of Chinese painting, history of Chinese painting, even to say history. My colleague Svetlana Alpers published an article called Is Art History, something like that, raising the whole question of whether you can have a history of art. And a lot of people since then don't even raise the question. They say no, narrative art history that makes stories about the paintings from one painting to the next is out. Okay, for me it isn't. That's what I'm saying. Now then, next slide. Here, this is the painting in ink on paper, whereas the others were on silk. Ink on paper from the late 12th, early 13th century by a great master named Xiaogui. This is a section of a hand scroll representing a Buddhist temple among the trees, among the groves by the riverside, with visitors in the foreground arriving. Okay, I'll talk about this hand scroll at great length. It's one of my favorite works of art anywhere. This is titled A Pure and Remote View of Streams and Mountains. I took the title of this whole series from that simply because it's one of my favorite works of all, A Pure and Remote View. Qishan Qingyuan too, anyway. And dated, as I say, to the late 12th or early 13th century, early 13th more likely. Okay, ink on paper, and this is as different from gouache as gouache was different from the colorful style of the other paintings that we saw. And then, actually, it's not far past this point where we will end the course. And in fact, Chinese landscape painting of the 13th century deals very heavily in mists and obscure distances and things glimpsed only fitfully through mists, atmospheric perspective, atmospheric dimming, all of that. Anyway, and the landscape almost seems to trail off into the distance the way the painting does. I hope you'll be very sorry to see it end. If you are not, I will have failed. Anyway, you see here how they have mastered the technique of using ink monochrome at a very high level to take you back at distance along with a receding shoreline. Sharply drawn, darkly drawn, fishing boats in the foreground, going back along the shore, fishermen with nets, a fishing village in the middle distance among the trees, still further back on the left now, upper left, a walled village with a gate which you can barely see in buildings, and then if we were to continue it would dissolve into mist altogether. Okay, I've suggested already a kind of developmental pattern within the history of Chinese painting through the Song Dynasty, which is not only, I think, clearly discernible, recognizable in the paintings themselves, properly understood. It's also reinforced, as I'll try to bring out as we go along, in the writings of Chinese critics and theorists, who recognized that Song period landscape could capture depths and nuances and subtleties of natural scenery that made earlier landscape, like the colorful picture we saw, landscape of the Tang Dynasty, look childish and artificial, that they had made, we can call in quotation marks, progress. They had moved to a greater naturalness, a greater capacity for expressing profound ideas among the artists. Well, I'll talk a lot about that. The practice of the artist, that is recognized and backed up by writings by the art critics and theorists of the time. And we have a series of what are in effect art historical accounts preserved from the 9th century onward. A great literature of early painting. Chinese ideas of truth to nature are not the same as Western ideas, of course. There's a different aesthetic. The idea of naturalness is more central to their thinking. The idea of avoiding the look of man-made things and so on. All this will be in my discussions as we go along. And in fact, I'll talk a lot about it. But my point is that the theorists and historians, art historians, so to speak, recognized that the painters collectively had achieved this kind of quasi-progress toward realism. So the art historical narrative sequence that I'll be trying to bring out clearly in considering the paintings, with some references to contemporary writings, is not by any means a pattern imposed on the materials by foreign art historians, as some ideologically motivated writers used to charge, claiming that Western art historians were trying to overlay the Chinese tradition of painting with developmental patterns that they had adopted from Wölfflin and other historians of European art. That was charged. It is not, I think, true. And if you end up, after watching and listening through this series, still believing something like that, well, you haven't looked and listened carefully enough, or I have failed, one or the other. Again, I have to emphasize that I'm not attaching value judgments to this historical process. I don't mean that Chinese painting got better and better as the centuries passed. Figure painting is certainly finer in the Tang period than later. Lots of people think that Guoxi is a greater artist than Xiaogui. Just as many people prefer Botticelli to Raphael, let's say. I'm talking instead about a kind of continuous, quasi-logical movement toward greater and greater truth to nature. Now I'll speak briefly about the principal tool of Chinese painting, the brush. The picture on the right is, the drawing is from Jerome Silbergelt's book, Figure 2, and titled Brush Structures and Dynamics. The picture on the left of actual brushes as the way they were exhibited at the Freer Gallery way back. Anyway, the Chinese brush, a wonderful instrument. The brush tip is conical, that is round in section throughout, not flat like some Western brushes used for oil painting and so on. And touched lightly on the paper or silk, it moves smoothly around, it produces a fine line that way. Put on more pressure and the stroke thickens. It has a perfect fluidity of movement. It can go equally in any direction without any difficulty. It holds a lot of ink because it's made with a kind of cavity in the center that holds ink or color. So Chinese painting begins, as I began my obscura Chinese painting book, as an art of line. So I said, and there's some truth in that. Although, as we'll see quickly, there is also a limited truth. That is, they outline forms in line to depict them, to make pictures of them. But brushstrokes in Chinese painting very early begin to depart in various ways from strict line, as we'll see. Anyway, now we'll go back to looking at the earliest examples of painting in China. Next slides. Here, two painted pots from the Neolithic period, from maybe 6,000 years ago. Banpo, a Neolithic site up near the city of Xi'an. And there's a good long discussion of Chinese Neolithic painted pots in the Thorpe and Vinograd book, which you can read. This bowl on the left has painted on it a mask, as you see, probably representing an actual mask worn by some kind of shaman or magician or whatever, and also a square with cross-hatching and triangles at the corners that is sometimes replaced in some of these pots by a fish, which has the same shape essentially, but the triangles are turned into fins and tail and head. This kind of morphology from pure design to image back to pure design is very important in early Chinese art, including bronze decor, and used to play a big part in my lectures. Here is another Banpo bowl in which a clear image of a fish appears in place of the rectangle, so they interchange. And next, here's a pair of bowls showing the interchange of recognizable fish and abstract design, put that way by the Chinese curators, that is, to make this point. Well, the change should go either way, image to design or design to image. That is, the morphology of form images and design forms in early Chinese art went both ways. This pot isn't from Bonpao, but from a different site, and is somewhat later, although still Neolithic. I used to use this and put this slide on the screen to talk about the big question, which for me is a real question, of what is art? How do you recognize a work of art? It's not a popular question. It's not even an allowable question now. And yet I think it's still important, and I would still attempt answers. They wouldn't be the same as everybody else's answers, but I would do it. And I believe it's a real question. Now, for me, I would put this on and say, now in what way is this a work of art? The painter, whoever he or she may have been, I say, well, it's he, because throughout this course pretty much I'm going to simply say he because of the likelihood of female painters is small. But at any rate, the artist, and I mean artist in this case, who painted this pot had something like an artistic sensibility. I mean, it's too early to talk about that really, but, and this works very interestingly, compellingly even, visually. First of all, the whole design works against and with the shape of the vessel very effectively, certain tension between them. It looks at first like it's bilaterally symmetrical, that is, each side mirroring the other, but it isn't really. Then it looks as if they're kind of mirror image. What is dark on one side is light on the other, but it isn't that either. It looks as though it has eyes, like it's a mask, but not quite. And everything about it, there's subtleties and tensions and ambiguities that hold our interest and make us look at it. And so for me, this is the kind of thing that constitutes art. The work of art is that which creates the experience of art, which is et cetera, et cetera. Then you try to define it. Okay, enough of that. I should add here that some of the Bonpao pots have scratch marks on them that some people have taken to be an early form of writing, and that may well be. Long ago at a symposium on calligraphy at Yale University, somebody had given a paper on the Bonpao pots and these scratches and so forth. And I suggested that we should recognize that here is I spoke up after the paper and said that here we see what seems to be the earliest form of writing in China and the earliest form of painting in China. That was true at that time. And so they were totally different, not technically, stylistically, everything. And this meant that this old thing about how painting and calligraphy have a single origin has to be regarded as a poetic truth, but not as something we really believe. Oh boy, I caused a big furor. Surprising that these old saws, these old statements, have such a passionate following. Fred Wong, Wong Fangyu, who was a major scholar calligrapher, some of you know him, he spoke up and said, Jim, you simply have to go back further, and then they do start together. They do have a single origin and so on. Well, okay, leaving that aside, that's not our subject. But I generally tend to reject or argue against these old cliches as things that kind of block our understanding more than they advance it. Now, going on, here is the next. Here, you recognize these people. This is the part of the famous Terracotta Army of Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin, located near Xi'an, found in pits around his tomb, which is around 210 BC. You find these reproduced everywhere. There were some 5,000 of these figures, full size, originally painted in realistic colors, looking as though they were all different at first. It turns out that they're not all different, that parts of them are made in molds, but they're combined in different ways, and there's so many of them that they have the effect of looking like a bunch of individuals or reproductions of individual soldiers. Remarkable technically. How they were made is still something of a mystery. Ceramicists can't figure out how they were done. They may have had to employ some hundreds of thousands of workmen maybe 10 or 20 years to produce all these. It still, as I say, baffles ceramic specialists. Well, so why do I put these people on the screen? To make a very simple but important point. And that is that realism in sculpture is relatively easy, and it's achieved in China relatively early. This is way back at the end of the Zhou dynasty, or in the beginning of the Qin, long before anything comparable is possible in painting. And why is it possible? Because, I say, realism in sculpture is relatively easy. If you want to make a realistic sculpture of a man, all you have to do really is take a man or a corpse of a man, push it down into the mud or into the clay, make a mold, and then cast a sculpture from it. The French sculptor Rodin was accused of doing that in the late 19th century. I think it's his famous portrait of the nude Balzac. At any rate, Rodin is supposed to have done that. He didn't really, but he had to make a real casting of a human being to prove to them that it didn't look like this at all. At any rate, it can be done. You simply imitate the real thing and you keep working at it until you have a clay image that is the same shape, basically, as the real thing, with armor. These people are all carrying bronze weapons and so on. Well, I used to make an imaginary story for my students in which the first emperor of the Qin calls together all his artisans, a big gang of them, and he says to them, okay, you guys are going to make me a terracotta reproduction of my army to bury around my tomb, and I'm going to come back here in 10 years, and I'm going to put your figures over here, and I'm going to put my army over there, and if I can tell the difference, off go your heads. Centuries of progress toward realism in sculpture would be sandwiched into a mere decade. Well, that was a joke, but there's some truth in it. Painting, you cannot simply look at something and paint a picture of it. You can sort of draw the outline. That's about as far as you can go. But all the problems of representing 3 dimensions or volumetric 3-dimensional objects on a flat surface, or representing space, or of relating things in space, and all the problems, and the texturing and shading and all that. These are all things the artists have to work out slowly and over a period of a long time. And that is what we'll be following up as we go. So I put the figures on simply to make this, I say, simple but important point. And here is a bronze vessel also from the late Zhou, or the Qin period, in the shape of a rhinoceros. Very realistic, as you see. I put this on as another example of how sculpture can develop realistic styles far earlier than painting can. Now, next slides, please. 2 objects. Here, the one is a silver inlaid design in a bronze vessel, the type called bianhu, flat hu, famous piece in the Freer Gallery, 5th, 4th century BC or so, and a design on a lacquer dish from a place called Changsha, maybe a bit later, but still late Zhou probably, with design on it that is originally from animal or figures that have been dissolved into pure design. Now, I put these on to call your attention to an article that Max Lohr published in 1968 in the Archives of the Chinese Art Society of America, titled "The Fate of the Ornament in Chinese Art," one of the many really profound and valuable publications that Max Lohr made. His observation is profound and true, and that is that in the early periods of Chinese art, the great bronzes and jades and things and other materials from early China, it's an ornamental art that prevails, and the art is primarily ornamental, not pictorial. If the bronze elements look like pictures, that's, you almost could say, deceptive. Lohr got into a lot of trouble for suggesting that, but that's another issue. At any rate, that you have primarily an ornamental art coming down through the early centuries of Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, and that it's only gradually and late, from the late Zhou on, shall we say, that it gradually comes to be replaced by a pictorial art in which pictures predominate. these ornamental designs as we see them here are very highly evolved, sophisticated, way beyond anything in pictorial art of the time, as we'll see in a moment. So then how did pictorial art in China begin, really? The earliest stirrings of it may have come from outside, from the nomadic cultures to the north and the east of China, the designs on the so-called hunting-style bronzes. I won't stop to make the argument for that at length. It's just something I believe, and I won't stop to, it's not crucial to our subject, so I'm not going to argue about it at length now. Anyway, here is a bronze Hu vessel, Hu type, and with it a detail of the design. This is a fairly simple one. Some of them are more complicated than this, but so these may have had some kind of inlay at an early point. Now they're just bronze designed with a sort of sunken ground and slightly raised figures. Okay, some of them show hunting scenes, a figure confronting an animal with a spear, or here a figure with a bird's head firing an arrow at a monster figure at the other side, and so on. Images of this kind. And they are probably, they repeat on the vessel and from one vessel to the next, and are probably made with some kind of stencil or stamp, and so on. And they come presumably from the north and east of China, and belong originally with these nomadic cultures and come down into China. That's a big subject which I'm not going to talk about. But it's interesting that the beginnings of Chinese pictorial art, as we can see them here really, may not be properly Chinese at all. Okay, now on to the next one. Here is another vessel of the type Hu, with a much more elaborate design, probably a bit later. Max Lohr always called it the Yannings Hu, Yanning, Jannings, because it was owned part of the collection of a collector in Beijing, and when he was there, called Werner Yannings. He was the brother of the great actor Emil Yannings. Emil Yannings is the old professor who was captivated by Marlene Dietrich in The Blue Angel. Also plays in The Last Laugh, Faust, other things. Anyway, Werner Yannings had this important bronze collection, had to leave it behind when he was repatriated, like Lohr, back to Germany, and it's now in the Palace Museum in Beijing. And it's a famous vessel, and the vessel and the picture, the drawings of the design on it, are published in most old books as part of the beginnings of Chinese pictorial art. It takes us a little past the hunting-style bronzes, quite a long ways past actually, in that now the images, although similar, are organized into pictures, into more elaborate designs by ground lines, or the lines that represent the decks of boats or a wall or whatever, and the figures are arranged on them. It's all very much flat and two-dimensional still, of course. In this one, on the lower register, we see a battle going on between two boats, and the people up on top are wielding spears and hooks, people down below rowing, a man in the water between them, and anyway, a battle of boats. On the other side, on the left side, it's a battle going on, people trying to scale a wall. The defenders up on the top with daggers and spears and so on, defending the wall. Others down below climbing up scaling ladders and so on. A battle. And up above, here on the upper left, for instance, you see a very interesting scene, and we'll see it a bit better in a detail in a minute, of a building, a two-storied building seen in pure elevation, simple profile, as if open, and down below people are striking on suspended bells and sounding stones, and up above people who are performing some kind of ceremony. And elsewhere you have archers firing up into the air, shooting down birds with weighted arrows, and so on. In other words, the figures are still flat and simple and repeated, but they are being organized into early forms of pictures. Okay, here's a detail This is from a similar vessel in which the inlay is still there. I think it's gold inlay. There may be some kind of copper inlay in this case. There's one vessel with gold inlay, similar. At any rate, inlay in bronze from the late Zhou period, and this shows the battle on the wall. The figures on top brandishing their weapons, fighting off the people who are climbing up these scaling ladders and so on down below. Flat, two-dimensional. And here another detail, and this shows that building, two-story building. In the lower story, to the left, people striking on bells of different size, which were hung in series and struck to make a scale. Lothar von Falkenhausen at the University of California in Los Angeles has written a book on these, very learned, and telling what you want to know about them. And here is an actual set of bells and the stands, archaeologically recovered in a great tomb find from the late Zhou period, and others on the right striking sounding stones. Here is a set of sounding stones suspended on a reconstructed stand. Over far right you see a drum suspended, and people on both sides of it striking the drum. And here we see a real drum stand from a late Zhou tomb, and I think it must be a reconstructed drum. The drum would be put on the stand. It would look like something like what we see in the painting. And then up on the second story, some kind of ritual going on, hard to say, ceremony, sacrifice, anyway. All full of movement now, and as I say, being organized into pictures. Okay, onward from that. Now we begin to get into real painting. We have quite a lot of painting from the late Zhou period, actually earlier too, but especially late Zhou, in lacquer. Lacquer, which is made from the sap of the lacquer bush, colored with mineral pigments, red and brown and black principally. Lacquer is a very inert substance once it is hardened, and so lacquer lasts very well, and pictures made with lacquer have been preserved, where pictures on silk and paper largely haven't. We have a couple survivals, but that's quite remarkable. Okay, these are some fragments of painted lacquer from late Zhou period, maybe 4th century BC or so. I forget exactly, but something like that. Anyway, these are from the north, I think, actually. Very well preserved, as I say. Up here in the upper left, a figure, some kind of shaman or magician maybe, standing on a platform, red, and seemingly conjuring up or raising a dragon which appears in front of him, holding some kind of scepter. To the right of that is somebody shooting an arrow at a monster or an animal. Down below to the left, two people carrying an animal they've slain over their shoulder on a pole, and then various monsters, looking very much like the three-dimensional monsters which were found in late Zhou tombs sometimes. Okay, these are still flat and interesting, lively pictures, but then more remarkable. Now we can finally get into real real paintings. The first of them, there are two of them, and they were both found at a place called Changsha, or near Changsha, down in southeast China. You can find it on the map. I'm not going to show a map. Down in Hunan province. And marshy ground there, and some extraordinary system of burial, which allowed tombs from the late Zhou and Han periods, that is the centuries BC and immediately AD, to be remarkably preserved so that ordinarily perishable materials in them, like wood and silk fabric and silk paintings and so on, have been seemingly miraculously preserved. At the beginning of the next lecture, we're going to see actually the marvelously preserved body of one of the occupants of the tomb. But that'll come next lecture, which is on the Han Dynasty, art of the Han Dynasty. But from the late Zhou Dynasty, we have two remarkable paintings, quite amazingly preserved, which allow us to see actual painting of the late Zhou period, something like 3rd century BC, end of the Zhou Dynasty. The material is silk in both cases, line drawing and ink, more than line drawing the other one, as we'll see in a bit, but essentially line drawing, and some pigment. The pigment is still preserved. It's hard to see here, but it really gives a sense of what late Zhou painting looked like. Now, one of them, the one we're now looking at, is painted on silk, as I say, with ink and some pigment, represents a man holding a sword, perhaps the occupant of the tomb, maybe being carried into the afterlife, hard to say. I'm not going to be trying interpretation as we go along. I won't be talking about the subject. I'm talking about style. The whole course, as I've said many times, haven't said enough, is going to be visual, visual, visual. It's going to be looking. And I'm going to be talking about looking and helping you look and pointing out things you can see if you look hard and so on. Okay, anyway, he's riding in this dragon, which is rather like a boat. Behind him, perched on the dragon's tail, is what appears to be a crane, and an umbrella up above covers over them all. Wong, in the 3,000 Years book, page 21, quotes mentions of painting and artists from Han period writings, and these are interesting. Mostly they speak of collaborative projects, artisan work, not individual artists. But there's also, and he quotes it, a remarkable anecdote found in a text ascribed to the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher. Many of you know the book of Zhuangzi, a late Zhou period. Arthur Waley translated some of Zhuangzi anyway. And in this anecdote, the ruler of one of the states of that time, the Song state, needs to have a painting done. So he calls his artists together, and they all come, bowing and scraping and showing off their skills and so on. But one of them arrives late. He takes off his outer clothes, and he sprawls comfortably outside, in no hurry to present himself. "Aha," says the ruler, "that is the true artist," and he hires him to do the job. Well, that's a remarkable story for so early a period. The idea of the artist as an exceptional being will continue to turn up in writings of the later period, as we'll see. Okay, and that raises the question, how can this non-conformist artist painting have been different from the painting of the common artisans? Not a question we can answer. We don't have enough, except by looking at the paintings of this time and using them to suggest possibilities. Unfortunately, as I say, we now have a very few actual paintings from late Zhou, notably these two, this picture and another. Here's a detail, by the way, of the one of the man with the sword riding on the dragon. It's done, as you see, in outline, fine line, even line generally, and with an addition of some color. Then the other one, here seeing the whole thing, putting the two together, the other one represents a woman, perhaps a shamaness, standing with her arm raised and conjuring up maybe a dragon and phoenix, making them appear before her. It's a little like one of the things we saw in the painted lacquer, where somebody seems to be conjuring up a dragon. This is slightly smaller than the other one. The other one, with the man, is about 37 centimeters high. This one's about 31 centimeters high. Okay. It's important to note here, by the way, that the images I use are going to be made mostly from slides. Some of them from reproductions will vary very widely and wildly in color, lighting, and fidelity to the original in every possible respect. There's no help for that. I'm not making any claims for accuracy of color or general look. Slides that transmitted the real look of the painting might be invisible or hard to see on the cinema screen, so to speak. All serious students of Chinese painting have to spend a lot of time looking at originals in museums or wherever they can see them, and I certainly advise you to do that. Don't take the slides or the reproductions as visually truthful. They will tell you things about the painting that I can be showing you, and particularly slides made close-up from the original. Now, the slides I'm going to be showing of this painting, of the woman, are the first ones made from an original painting. We'll see lots of them throughout the course, which I myself or somebody else made from the original painting, going in close with a flash gun with a light for details. And these can reveal features of the painting that are hard to see even if you have the original in front of you. Anyway, here is the woman. And I put her beside the man, the two of them. The writer of the 3,000 Years text reproduces both of these and then writes, quote, "The two paintings share drawing techniques and a compositional formula. Images are outlined in ink, blank, 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 etc." Continuing, "The main difference between these works lies in the degree of artistry. The female figure appears as a silhouette. The outlines are rather coarse and uneven, apparently by an unassured hand." End quote. Well, I can see how one might make that judgment from a reproduction, but I would differ from it and judge the painting differently, and I'll take you closer into the painting using detailed slides that I was able to make from the original long ago, and show you why I feel that way. It's true that the painting of the woman is less firmly defined and a less substantial image than that of the man riding the dragon. It's not drawn in the same kind of controlled fine line, but this can also be seen as a deliberate difference in style. Okay, here we go on now to another slide from the shaman, a picture of the shamaness, getting a little closer. She stands with her arm raised, wearing a robe, and in front of her, this great bird, I'll call Phoenix for convenience, and the dragon further off writhing, as though, as I say, she is somehow conjuring them up. Okay, here is a close-up of the woman and her robe. Now we begin to see the drawing, how the artist has used the brush. And partly it's to fill in black in the outlines, partly it's just to outline, that is to define the forms by drawing lines around them. I started my Skira book by saying that to paint is, quoting an old text saying, to paint is to draw outlines, something like that. Well, that's true, but now, as I say, I come to realize that it isn't only that. The Chinese artists from very early times are doing more than that. Come on, now the next slide. Now we're getting in close and we see closer the woman's head and hand and so on. Now we see that the line differs. And you remember the slide showing how the brush was used. You push a little harder on the brush and it becomes thicker line. You raise it or you touch lightly and it's a thin line. Where the artist draws the woman's hand with the 5 fingers, it has to be fine line. You couldn't draw it otherwise. The face of the woman and the eyebrow and eye are drawn in very fine, fairly fine, continuous line. The robe is drawn in somewhat heavier line. And down here at the bottom of the sleeve, the line thickens as it goes around the sleeve. And the design on her robe, on her sleeve, the design actually of 2 much dissolved animals, either with heads and eyes. But anyway, the brush strokes used for those thicken and thin rhythmically and quite beautifully to represent the decorative designs on her robe. Now we go in another slide here and we look at the phoenix and dragon. They are really very interesting indeed. They have, as I originally had, pigment on them. The pigment is largely come off and hard to see. But as we look at them, we see that even more. The phoenix in particular is drawn in brushwork that is not simply continuous line at all. The phoenix is not defined, that is, or depicted simply by drawing a even line around it and presenting it as a silhouette image. Well, as I say, I began by quoting my old Skira Chinese painting book from an old Chinese dictionary saying, to paint is to draw boundaries. I misquoted before. That is to say, to draw a linear outline to define the form, and then to do some interior drawing. But in fact, next please, let's see, coming in closer, here is the dragon. Now when you look at them closely, you find that it's not outlining simply at all. Look at the dragon's arm, or leg rather, reaching out here from the body. And it's 2 lines, but they don't really join. One of them curls around the other bends and goes upward. It isn't outlined. It's two quite distinct lines. The next, please. And here, this quite wonderful slide, representative of the upper part of the phoenix. Okay, well, let's look at various things. The crest on the head of the bird, a single stroke, curling, thickening and thinning quite beautifully. The line defining its neck, which goes down into the wing, doesn't outline the form at all. It ends in a kind of spiral, open, wide open. The wing here doesn't end, isn't continuous. There's a gap. The tail is not attached to the body. And these two long plumes, beautiful, which are turned into some kind of animals themselves by having heads with eyes. These two long plumes are not attached to the body. In other words, what's really important is that we don't have something that is simply outlined in ink line at all. The image is produced, that is, as a structure or a configuration of brush strokes. Now it's important, very important to note this. It's already a break with the basic means of simply drawing a line around the thing, as is done basically in the other painting, One of the Man. A really very important break. Now, reading these brush strokes, we are made conscious of the movement of the brush on the one hand, but also the pressure applied to the brush by the artist. We are feeling the brush movement, so to speak, the varying pressure on the brush, the movement of the brush. This gives a certain energy to the lines and the strokes that make up the form. Long ago, I used the somewhat ponderous academic term empathic kinesthesis for this quality. That is, empathic because you're feeling somebody else, what somebody else did. Kinesthesis, the feeling of movement, feeling your own movement. Kinesthetic. Empathic kinesthesis means feeling somebody else's movement in effect, and that's what we're doing. I don't use the term anymore, but the concept is still there. And when we look at brushwork in Chinese painting, as we do endlessly and over again, and it's much of what you look at in Chinese painting, you are responding in that way, and to a very sensitive, controlled kind of movement. That kind of response to the execution of paintings, in addition to, or even instead of the imagery of paintings, partly underlies the great value the Chinese put in brushwork, in judging paintings. C.C. Wong always said brushwork is what really matters. He compared it to the voice of a operatic singer. You don't go to the opera to learn the story, you know that already. You go to hear the voice of the singer. And the brushwork, you don't look at a picture to see the scenery, as he called it, rather disparagingly. Yeah, it's the brushwork that matters. Well, he exaggerated that a bit too much, or overemphasized it a bit. I am now more inclined to go back and spend more time looking at the picture, but that's another issue. Max Lohr points out on the first page of his book that what was sought after in Chinese painting from the very beginning was not some accuracy of representation, not really truth to life, but a certain aliveness. Centuries later, a Chinese theorist is going to use the term Qiyun Shangdong. My Chinese is no good. My terms are bad. But anyway, a four-character term that means something like engender movement through spirit resonance as the supreme quality that the artist should strive for and that viewers should look for in paintings. Do we see it already here, something of that? I don't know. Maybe this in this simple picture. If we look at it sympathetically and close up, we see a lot that we don't see at first, and we see that it's not simply an image made by drawing a line around the phoenix. Okay, so much for our first lesson. We've learned, I think, some important things about early Chinese painting, including a few that you won't find in the books. And that's the purpose of these lectures, really, to look hard, to learn things that you can't find by reading. There's going to be a lot more of this kind of thing in the lectures to come. And in the next one, I'll start out by telling how I was able to make slides like this from this very early painting. Before this first lecture closes, I want to deliver some heartfelt thanks, which will serve for the whole series. Most of all to my collaborator, Ran Chatterjee of Chatterbox Films, who is listed in the titles as producer, but in fact is producer, director, technical advisor, pretty much everything except me talking for these films. He's done most of it. And he took my original conception, which was something much, much simpler, a simple filming of my old slide lectures, and through his remarkable technical knowledge and experience, turned them into a new form, making them immeasurably better than anything that I conceived of. The president of the Tong Foundation, who very modestly doesn't want to be named, urged me at lunch here in Vancouver about 2 years ago to embark on this series, which I was sort of hesitating about. And he more or less promised to provide me with the original funding for the series out of his personal foundation, as he has done. So he too deserves a lot of the credit for whatever success we have. Jan Eklund, long ago my student at Berkeley, who has headed the visual resources section of the my history of art department at Berkeley, my old department, used to be called the slide room. She responded with all her knowledge and abilities to the challenge of producing hundreds of digitized images from the slide library. Big, big job, and has helped to make this possible. And even more, Samantha Zhou, who was the person who does Asian slides there, or Asian materials. She has spent a great deal of her time and expertise on this project. Much of it in unpaid work done outside hours, just out of sheer belief in the value of what we're doing. She too deserves a lot of credit for whatever success this series is going to have. I want to thank my many teachers and colleagues and the many museums and universities and other institutions that have supported me over the decades of my career. And for this project in particular, I owe a big debt of gratitude to our sponsoring organization, and that is the Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of California, especially to the two people who are in charge of, respectively, program coordination, that's Caverly Carey, and publications, Kate or Catherine Chauta, along with the present director of the Institute, who is my old friend and colleague, Ye-Wan Shin. They took on this large, time-consuming project as one of to which they were personally committed, and they've, again, like others, devoted a great deal of time to it, and have worked tirelessly to bring it to the point where now we can release it free of charge to the world at large. And it's this is part of their educational aim of promoting and disseminating Asian scholarship in East Asia. Now, it's only with the constant and untiring support of all these people that I can present to you now the fruits of this, my major late life project, A Pure and Remote View. Thank you, all of you. Okay, that's all for this lecture. See you next Monday. Have a good weekend. Bye.